Somebody makes a change and it breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. They're not sure who knows who to fix it.
Today's guest is Dr. Margaret-Anne Storey, co-author of the SPACE framework. Her recent work examines how generative AI is transforming software engineering and recently published a paper on the hidden cost of AI-generated code.
Let's dive into the paper you mentioned about this triple model.
Technical debt, it's well known right across the industry, and it can also refer to other kinds of debt like security debt or architecture debt. And then cognitive debt refers to what's in our minds, this loss of kind of understanding of what you're building. And then intent debt is about poor externalization of what are the goals, what are the decisions that we've made, but also what have we decided not to do.
We all come to a point where I just accept whatever AI suggests to me. This term is called cognitive surrender. What is exactly that?
Let me start with what's the difference between cognitive offloading and cognitive surrender. Cognitive offloading is when we offload a task to some automation, maybe a calculator or something, but we're in control. We understand what's happening. With cognitive surrender, you're surrendering not just your understanding of it, but also your ability to learn.
There's now side effects that people are thinking about. The cost to the human himself or herself. What's the aspect of human that we can call out as well?
Now you're managing all these agents and keeping track of them. That's a lot of cognitive load, a lot of complexity. Not to mention that those agents are creating a very complex software really fast. No wonder people are fatigued. And people are not doing that as much as asking each other. They're asking their chatbot, their agents, and not talking to other people on their team as much. And that's tiring to be by yourself all the time.
Hey, quick pause. My goal with Tech Lead Journal is simple. Learn from the best in tech so we can all grow together. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe to follow the channel. It's the biggest way for you to support the show and help us keep bringing great guests and insights to you. Thanks for being here, and let's get back to it. Hello everyone, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I have someone who I talked to about 3 years ago. It's been a while. So her name is Dr. Margaret-Anne Storey. So she's actually one of the leading, experts, published a lot of papers related to developer productivity, developer experience. And lately, she's also coming up with a new paper about the triple debt. We're going to talk a lot about this paper, definitely, and also the impact of AI in our day-to-day development activities. So welcome to the show, Margaret. Looking forward for this conversation again.
Sure, thanks. Good to see you again, Henry.
Yeah. So, Margaret, maybe in the very beginning, right? So it's been 3 years. I think when we spoke last time, there was no, kind of like inkling of AI or so to speak, right? Like the impact on all the software development activities. So in the last maybe 3 years, if you can summarize what has actually happened.
Yeah, I think everybody has experienced this change in the last 3 years. I remember I'm also a teacher. I teach students as well as do research. And I was teaching software testing, but at the third year level at the university when Copilot came out at the very end of the term. And I remember thinking, wow, everything I have just taught my students about software testing, all of the different techniques can now be pretty much automated using Copilot. And I actually showed my students Copilot right before the end of the term to kind of give them a little preview of what's coming. But I also told them, look, it's really important that you do know these techniques so that when you use tools like this going forward, it will help you know, whether your tests are complete or not, and you understand the fundamentals. Understanding the fundamentals of the why behind these kinds of tests as well was so important. So that was kind of the beginning, I guess, for me. And then as a researcher, working with companies, like I've been working with Microsoft for about 10 years now, and other companies like DX, just seeing the huge impact that we've all experienced with generative AI and now agentic AI is having across the entire industry. And it's a wild ride. It's a wild ride for all of us. We're all trying to figure it out. And what's kind of cool right now is that nobody really has the answer to how we should be doing things. So we're all trying to figure this out together. It's kind of all hands on deck, all trying different things, trying to get it under control. The disruption is huge. I've studied disruptions before in software engineering. So I studied the impact of social media on software developers and tools like Stack Overflow and GitHub and even using Twitter and how that was having an impact on how developers communicate with each other. And that was a big change too. But generative AI is the biggest disruption that I've seen so far. So yeah, hope that helps for a little start of our discussion.
Yeah. I wasn't aware that you had this study about social media impact, but
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, the magnitude of the AI impact is probably greater to me because it really touches on the day-to-day activities of a software developers, right? So,
Yeah.
I think recently you delved into these topics, about, cognitive debt, triple debt, and about this problem that I think for every developers who have used AI a lot recently, they are having this issue, right? About understanding exactly what happened after they use AI a lot in their software development. So maybe let's start from there because I think what brought you into this topic, right? What made you wanted to write this paper in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I was observing what was happening across the industry, of course, as well, and teams and developers, some of them really jumping on to using it really quickly and adopting it, and others not. But things really came ahead for me in terms of a course that I was teaching again. So it's a course called Startup Studio at the University of Victoria. And it's a fourth year senior course. It brings together senior students in software engineering as well as students from business together to build a startup over the term. And I've been teaching that course actually since 2014, so I've kind of seen it go through the evolution. We have industry founders that come in and mentor the students and talk to the students during the term. And they have to go very, very quickly. They have to build an MVP, get an idea, a novel idea that people really want, and they have to build that tool and get the first MVP, very, very simple MVP, into the hands of users really within about 6 or 8 weeks of the course, and then have something that folks are using by the end. That was always a big challenge, to be honest. It's hard to stand up that early MVP that, even with the minimal, viable features that it has, getting people to use that was a struggle. But they would manage it during the 12 to 13 weeks of the term. And then, of course, AI came along and teaching it in, let me get my years correct, 2023, the students didn't use it as much as I thought they would, either in the products that they were making or using it themselves. So 2024, I kind of leaned into saying, look, you're going to be, if you're going to create this company, because some of them do, they stay on and they make companies after the course, you need to be leaning in to use AI to go as fast. And some of them did in 2024, but not as many again as I thought, even though we did demos. Look at how quickly you can use AI to create your MVP. And it wasn't until 2025 in the first week that myself and my wonderful TA from the year before, we just kind of walked through, the idea that he had actually taken the course and he walked through with them how he had spent an entire term building that. The year before, he used AI a bit then, but not that much. Of course, things had advanced. And he showed how he could now build it in the matter of a few minutes in September of 2025. So we really encourage the students to lean in and use AI, both for the development part, but also for the business part. So coming up with a business plan and thinking about the different features and the users and other aspects of the product that they were building. And for the software engineering students, I really did recommend to them, of course, that, you've got to use all of the things that you learned. Remember that testing course, remember that requirements course, remember, the different techniques that you've learned for validating the tool is meeting your users' needs. Test-driven development, do that. Write down what your requirements are, write down what your architectural decisions are. And then I kind of let them loose because I'm not teaching them how to code necessarily. I'm more focused on the startup side. And it wasn't until at first, they were going really fast. I had not seen anything like that before. Within a few weeks, they had the earliest MVP, that you could imagine. I was also asking them to share their reflections week by week. And their reflections were saying things like, wow, I'm learning so fast. I just have an idea and it's creating it for me. And the business students were also saying that. They were also learning a little bit how to write code not write code themselves, but use the AI to help them vibe code some of the features. So that was great. But then about 8 weeks in, I started hearing things from some of the business students and some of the software students saying, yeah, we know we needed to make that change, but it's really hard to do. And I'm like, what do you mean? That's not a difficult change. And at first I thought, okay, they have accumulated a lot of technical debt. That's what I assumed. And I thought, okay, I'll sit down and chat with them. And then as I'm chatting with them, I realized that not many people across the team really understood how the code worked, or their architecture. When I asked them to describe the architecture, they weren't able to do that very well either. And when I asked, well, who knows about this part? They didn't even seem to know who knew what. So I realized at that point we have a problem, and I called it cognitive debt back in October, and that was kind of the first kind of inkling I had that, okay, this use of AI, particularly in the startup kind of realm where they feel the pressure to go fast, is bringing other risks that is eventually going to slow them down. Actually, it brought one of the teams, as I mentioned, to a halt. And other teams recognize this themselves. So, there was one team where one of the members, he had done a lot of co-ops, and he said, okay, we got to stop. We got to stop. We got to roll back. We got to, start over with some of the stuff because this is going to break. And we're onto something good here. So we need to kind of start over and make sure we have control. Yeah, so I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, very interesting story. I think many people could relate to that, right? Especially they do a lot of this, AI-driven, AI-assisted development, vibe coding, right? Especially for vibe coding, I think the danger is really, really high. So why this understanding problem becomes an issue compared to last time, right? So I think software developers, we all are very familiar with technical debt. We always think
Yep.
about, okay, when we want to go faster, fix our technical debt. But now when you mentioned about this cognitive debt, why now, right? Why in the past we didn't really have this problem?
We always have this problem. We always have this problem. My PhD work many years ago was in program comprehension. I'm trying to help developers understand the code that either they had written, or more often than not, the code they hadn't written that, was legacy system code. So my PhD was about visualizing the architecture recovery, and visualizing that in a way that would help people new to a code base understand it so that they could improve it in some way. So this cognitive debt has always been around, and it's just that we didn't name it. And poor comprehension. I mean, I used to write a lot of code many years ago. Even myself, I'd write something, and I'd write a visualization tool, and then I wouldn't touch it for 3 months because I was teaching a course. And then I'd go back to it and I'd try to start making changes. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't remember how this works. So this is not a new problem. It's just the speed, the scale at which we're going. And, I realize even myself when I'm, by coding, and I'm trying not to, and I'm trying to slow down, that I'm accumulating cognitive debt way faster than I had before. Because to really understand something, it takes, deliberate reflection, deliberate practice, to really understand what it is that we're either trying to learn or we're trying to build, and maintain that understanding of it. So when we generate something, and if you're, spinning up lots of agents and they're all creating different pieces, and then you have another agent putting it together, you're going to accumulate kind of that loss of understanding a lot faster.
Yeah, especially I think I feel the past 1 year or so, right? When the speed of
Yeah.
these AI coding tools really accelerate a lot, and people are competing, right? I mean, the Anthropic, OpenAI, and Gemini, for example, they are competing so fast. So it's like we are kind of like being, I don't know, like pampered with all these features. At the same time, the industry are also pushing us to actually use a lot more AI. And
Yeah.
that's, the cycle continues, right? So we are using AI a lot more. And I'm sure in some parts of the teams, they might feel this potential problem, right? So maybe
Yeah.
let's dive into the paper itself, because you mentioned about this triple model. There's this
Yeah.
technical debt, we mentioned cognitive debt, then there's another one. So maybe I'll let you explain what are the three debt
Yeah.
models.
Yeah. So technical debt, I mean, it's well known right across the industry, and it, it can also refer to other kinds of debt like security debt or, architecture debt. So I won't talk about that a lot because I think people really have a good handle on what that means. And then cognitive debt, I've explained pretty well, this loss of kind of understanding of what you're building. One of the things I want to pull out about cognitive debt is that what I noticed in my teams and what I'm also hearing from practitioners as well is that there is also this loss of transactive memory. So who it is on the team that knows how these different components work. So that is also, I mean, transactive memory in software development was also a long-term problem. It's been studied in software engineering research. But it's accelerating again now as well. So that's kind of cognitive debt. And I think of it as a property of the system health, just as technical debt is. And then the third kind of debt that I added to this triple debt model is intent debt. And I mentioned working, I'll go back to my students again. So when I was chatting with them, I'm like, so why do you have this feature in the product? And they would look at each other and be a little blank about, because we forget why this is here. So they, even though we were telling them, I mean, we were guilty of it too, right? We were telling them to go fast. They weren't necessarily writing down what the user goal was, how those goals kind of map to different user needs, how those needs map to features, how those features then in turn would lead to certain architecture decisions that you would make and then, generate the code. So there wasn't this good kind of articulation across that or a good externalization of the different things. So not only were they on the team forgetting, but the agents that they were using also didn't have that context, right, for building. So the agent was kind of like started to hallucinate. So I mentioned I had them create these diaries, these logs of what they were doing. And over time, they were saying things like, anything I ask, it's just breaking. And it's just hallucinating stuff like crazy. And so we were seeing that as well. The agents were also not having that right kind of context, right, for making changes as they went forward, as their products became more complicated. So that was the three. So technical debt is about what's in the code. Cognitive debt refers to what's in our minds, across the team. And then intent debt is about, poor externalization of what are the goals, what are the decisions that we've made, not only what are the decisions that we've made, but also what have we decided not to do, writing that down, as well as, decisions about the architecture, technology choices, and so on.
Right. And I like one of the kind of like summary of all these three data you put in the paper. So technical debt, it lives in the code, right? Cognitive debt lives in the people, in the brain, in the mind.
Yeah.
And the last one, intent debt, lives in the artifacts, right? The context that you mentioned. So I like the term that you mentioned, transactive memory, right? Because I use AI quite a lot as well. And sometimes I really don't remember what I actually did last time. And especially people, when they spin up multiple agents in parallel, I know it's kind of like a trend these days. You spin up a lot of agents, let them work on all these three tasks at the same time, and you just review the PI at the end of the day, right? With maybe massive lines of code, and which, again, it exacerbates the problem, right? And then you move on, right? Picking up new features. So definitely, I think this transactive memory can become a real challenge for developers. And for intent debt especially, we referring this a lot to context engineering, which people have been talking a lot to prevent hallucination, improve, the agentic workflow. So maybe is this related to that as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think we're seeing a lot of tools. I'm seeing a lot of articles coming out about harness engineering and context engineering that are really, kind of putting this harness right around the agents, right? Creating not only guardrails, but also giving that context, right, for the agents to use. In terms of intent specifications as well, I think like one of the things that I put in my paper when I wrote it back in February was intent. What did I call it? Intent first driven development or something like that. And some people kind of disagreed with that. And I could see why, because it's like, that sort of sounds like waterfall, like spending all the time creating, and we should talk about that a little bit, but spending all this time kind of writing your specifications up front, and then using that to guide the agents, right, about what it is that you're intending to do. So I see intent debt being somewhat addressed by some of these tools. Like I've been playing around with Spec Kit lately myself as well. Using those tools to, in particular, help you write down what you're doing, but also help the agents as well. Like having a Claude.md or agents.md file for the agents to have that context. So I would also say that I see, to a certain extent, some fragmentation across the industry. Different people are almost rediscovering the same kind of things, slight differences, but we're starting to see some patterns and some recognition that we need these kinds of tools for supporting us. But one of the things that worries me a little bit about that and some of the tools that we're using is that we can go. I'm using the analogy of a sailboat because I like to sail, and I don't race anymore, but I used to race sailboats, and it kind of reminds me of you can have your boat is singing, everything's working really well on the boat, and the crew is doing everything right, and they all have awareness of who knows what on the boat, but you're going really fast, but you're going in the wrong direction. Right? Or the direction has changed, right? Like you were supposed to go over here, and in the middle of a race course, this happens when there's a wind shift. The committee will pick up a marker and they'll move it. And if you're not paying attention, you won't see that, oh, the marker's not there anymore. I mean, this doesn't happen very often, but it has happened when I've been on races. And so you're going super, super fast, but you're not going in the right direction. And I think intent debt can also accumulate, or intent drift can also accumulate if we're not constantly kind of checking in with our end users. Is this still what they want? So deploying, not just doing A/B testing, that's not enough, but deploying it to our users and doing user research. So listening to our users because their needs might have changed, right, in the time that we created our product. But I'm not sure I actually answered your question. I think I drifted. Talking about drift, I might have drifted away from your question. You're not.
No, I think you kind of like answered that. So one simple thought that people have, especially when they have this AI, right? So once they accumulate this cognitive debt or maybe some intent debt, they actually think they can use AI back to kind of like explain the code, explain kind of like an intent. Do you think this is also a viable solution, using AI to actually help you improve your cognitive understanding about this stuff?
To a certain extent, yes. I think that AI can both amplify your cognition, help you with understanding the code, and also erode it. So if you have good practices around making sure that you pause, right, to understand the code, that you do read the code and think about, the bigger picture while you're looking at your PRs, and you hit something in the code that you don't understand, but you are trying to understand it, then of course you can ask, Claude or whatever you're using to explain that piece of code, right, to you, and give you that understanding. So on the one hand, it can help you repair that loss of understanding. It can also help point out to you that maybe somebody else on your team hasn't actually looked at that part of the system for a while, and maybe they should. So in some ways, we can use AI absolutely to help repair and mitigate cognitive debt. But on the other hand, it can also lead to cognitive debt, right? If we're not mindful about it and don't have good practices and processes set up. And that was kind of why I wrote, that paper, was to say that it isn't just about technical debt. Just AI can also make technical debt worse, but it can also help address it. It's not, it's not going to make it disappear as a problem. I think it's always going to be a problem. And cognitive debt will always be a challenge as well. But we can use these tools in such a way, as long as we have good practices around them, to help us kind of keep on top of the 3 different types of debt. And the same for intent debt as well. That we can. Actually, somebody said to me when I was seeking feedback from the paper, we don't need to record the intent. We can just recover it from the code. I kind of disagree with that. I think it's a fair comment. It is a fair comment, right? But I disagree with it a little bit, because sometimes we make decisions that aren't in the code. So maybe I have decided in my MVP not to build this feature for a particular reason. Maybe I've decided it's too much, or maybe it introduces too many risks, or maybe there's something else that I can use off the shelf for that. And that may not necessarily appear in the code. So it has to be somehow recorded. And I think having it written down as well is something useful for the agents, right? And for other people to have a quick way to kind of get up to speed on what's going on.
Yeah, so I feel that this kind of thing, right, this kind of problem is not new to us. In the past, we also have this challenge with
Absolutely.
documenting stuff, updating it and all
Absolutely.
that. But again, like
Yeah.
the speed, the scale that you mentioned is really kind of like a different level today. And I think when you publish this kind of like idea about cognitive debt, many people also kind of like chime in, right? Like people like
Yeah.
Simon Williamson, right?
Yeah.
Martin Fowler and all that. So I
Yeah.
saw people giving you a lot of comments. So what do
Yeah.
you feel back then when such a viral kind of like a viral
Yeah,
trend
within
that
our little
people are
pond.
talking
It
about?
went viral in our pond. I was really surprised actually to see, I kind of put it out there and I thought, I wonder what people are going to say. And probably nothing, right? That's more likely what would happen. But I started hearing from a lot of people that they were, and people that I really respect that are really, really good developers, and they were like, oh yeah, that's happening to me. And everybody kind of knew it. It was the elephant in the room that we were all seeing, but nobody had a name. Nobody knew to call that thing the elephant, that this is cognitive debt and we have to pay attention to it. So I think it was just kind of the timing in the few months that these tools had really accelerated in the abilities that they had and the capabilities that they provided, that we were having this problem. And so I heard from a lot of people actually that these were the challenges they were having. Interestingly, I also heard from quite a few folks on, yes, we've known about this and this is what we're doing to address this, to mitigate this kind of cognitive debt and to repair it. So it was super interesting for me to have those conversations with practitioners and hear not only did these things resonate for them, but also that they were coming up with ways to address it as well.
Yeah, so I think definitely it's something that everyone can relate. So in
Yeah.
the beginning, I'm sure when people find these AI tools, right, they feel they are much more productive, right? But
Yeah.
obviously, there's this now side effects that people are thinking about, and I think you mentioned there's also the cost to the human himself or herself, right? Things like
Yeah.
feeling stress, and now what we call fatigue, right? And so I think
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
people mention that after using AI a lot in their day-to-day work, they feel much tired very, very fast, maybe a few hours, then they feel this kind of thing. So maybe tell us about this effect as well, because the cognitive
Yeah.
test, that is one thing, but what's the aspect of human that we can call out as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's many aspects to this, many dimensions to this, just like space, right? But on the one hand, I think maybe I'll start with a thing that's just kind of top of mind for me right now that I'm hearing a lot about. There's a lot of angst across the community. Developer jobs disappearing, developers being laid off and being replaced, with coding agents or whatever, automating their jobs away. So there's a lot of fear about that. And at the same time, there's a lot of push from a lot of organizations to adopt AI and go faster without necessarily giving the right space and time to learn those tools, to talk to others, to experience what it's like to use them, to fail with them, and then take those learnings and then put it back into how they're using them with their team. So I think that is part of, the challenges, the negative implications on developer experience that this is having across the industry. So that's one part. Another part is, you talked about spinning up these agents. I could see it on your face already that you were feeling this, oh my God, I have all these agents and they come back, they finished a task at different times. It's like for me having 10 graduate students, working on a project and then coming back at different times. I'm ready. Look at my cool thing and integrate it with this other cool thing. And you're trying to keep track and you're like, who are you again? So it's kind of the same thing with the agents. What did I ask you to do? And integrating those, that's a lot. When we think about managers, so Annie Vella talks about, this shift from developer to supervisory role. I think that's really apt. Because when you're a manager, if you're working in a company and you have 10 people, say, reporting to you, that's pretty much all you can do, right? I mean, okay, I know there's often pressure to do work as well, But managing, I remember my husband saying that to me once, and I said, I'm so busy. And he's like, how many students do you have? And I'm like, oh, I have 12. And he went, in his job where he worked, that was all they did was manage, right? And so now you're managing all these agents and keeping track of them. And that's a lot. That's a lot of cognitive load, a lot of complexity. Not to mention that those agents are creating a very complex software really fast with lots of dependencies, layers of abstraction on top of that. I mean, it's no wonder, right? People are fatigued. And yet at the same time, it's kind of fun, right? Like it's really fun. It's so cool to be able to create so quickly. I find myself staying up super late again, and building things because it's just, just one more thing, one more thing. And so, it's also that kind of, part of our human nature that we're having fun with it, but it can also, too much of anything can be tiring. And then the third part, I think, and my student, Artie Starr, has talked about this a lot in her thesis work. The first paper is out on that, on a troubleshooting theory. And she did a lot of interviews with developers and found sort of related how difficulty in troubleshooting code that you don't understand or, doesn't work the way that you expect can lead to a lot of cognitive fatigue. So when things work okay, and you're generating stuff and it's all working the way you expect, it's great. But then when something breaks, it's really hard to fix. And then you have to put a lot of energy and a lot of cognitive resources into fixing it. So I think that that's, one important part of it as well. And then I think there's another part, and I just thought of this, so I'm just going to go with it, because maybe we'll get to it later. But I don't know, because I haven't studied this, but I'd love, to hear from you. Maybe you've heard it from other people, but certainly from, some things that I've seen, it feels that the team members working with each other and talking to each other. Human, relatedness is really important, those relationships. And people are not doing that as much as asking each other. They're asking their chatbot, they're, with their agents and not talking to other people on their team as much. They're relying on the chatbots to give them, feedback on what they're doing or on their design. And that's tiring, to be by yourself, I think, all the time. You don't have those little mental breaks maybe that you had before of saying, hey, how's your day going? Oh, what are you working on? Those moments, I think it's just this, churning away and then frantically maybe integrating your stuff, with other team members. But I don't have data for that. It's just kind of a hypothesis that I have that lack of connection is kind of happening because of using generative AI so much. I'm
Yeah,
sure somebody
I
has
think
data on that.
I think that is quite happening. At least I can see also sometimes in my team.
Yeah.
When you can spin up so many things on your own, doing a lot of tasks on your own, I think the tendency is to kind of like do it, in silo, right? Why would I need to speak with others? Even when I want to know about the work that he does, right? I can just ask AI to kind of like explain me about this part, right? So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I can see this trend as well. Like people are more into this solo
Yeah.
mode and less interacting with each other. And
Yeah.
when worse is like they interact with just PR, right? So because some
Yes.
teams still have the PR approval process. So I think
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
challenge is that if you give other people a lot of PR at the same time, again, like that kind of like also doesn't help in terms of relationship. That's what I find,
Exactly.
at least.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, this happened during COVID. So we did studies together with some colleagues at Danae Ford, Robinson, and Jenna Butler, and Brian Hauk, and Tom Zimmerman. A bunch of us did some studies of developers working from home during COVID. And that was one of the main findings. Courtney as well, Courtney Miller, was that there was this lack of social interaction happening. So some developers were just like hiding at home and writing all the code and, not talking to others, not answering questions. And it sort of reminds me a bit of that, that lack of social interaction and social relationship is bound to have a negative impact on their well-being, as well as, perhaps also on their productivity.
Right. I like that all these researches that you have done kind of like enforcing each other, right? So
Yeah.
I want to also I want to also call out this term that I think really kind of like summarize what is happening, right? So I think some people have used these tools, and because of the amount of cognitive thing that comes into them, right? So we all come to a point where I just accept whatever AI suggests to me. So I think this term that you call out is called cognitive surrender. So I want to also ask you to spend some time explaining about this cognitive surrender. What is exactly that, and what is the risk of doing this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the risk, so the difference, maybe let me start with what's the difference between cognitive offloading and cognitive surrender. I'm not a psychologist, by the way, but this is my understanding. Cognitive offloading is when we offload a task to some automation, maybe a calculator or something. We still know, right? We're redistributing some of the mental work that we have to do to a tool. But we still have a good kind of, we're in control. We understand what's happening. Cognitive surrender is a term that is being, used, and it relates a bit to Kahneman's model, thinking fast and slow. That with cognitive surrender, you're also surrendering your understanding of what it is that you're trying to do. So you're surrendering not just your understanding of it, but also your ability to learn, right? So doing the thing but not learning. So it's a pretty new term, I think, that, or at least new to me, term that I'm seeing being used with AI, and it's definitely something that as educators, we're very concerned about and trying to figure this out. What should we be surrendering, and what should we be making sure that our students learn? But
Yeah.
I think cognitive surrender leads to cognitive debt. So,
Yeah.
as well as
So that
challenges with skill, right?
Yeah, definitely. This is not just for software development, right? So we all use other parts of AI as well, right? The chat
Yeah.
AI, right, where you ask
Yeah.
a lot of information, right, trying to
Yeah.
kind of like get information in a very quick manner, right? So definitely,
Yeah.
this is also happening
Yeah.
in that use
Yeah.
case as
And
well. Yeah,
we've done that for years, right? We did that with Google, right? It
yeah,
used to be that we remembered how to drive from A to B, and now it's like, no, you can't. You have to use, if Google Maps is down, you're done. And we've all found that, right? Calculator. I saw a coffee shop one time, close because their cash register wasn't working. They could access the cash, but they couldn't do the math. And I'm like, just write it on a piece of paper. And it was like, no, 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 we have to close. And I'm okay. So I mean, we've done that for years with technology. It's not something new. Again, it's just the pace at which we're doing it, and the pace at which we're figuring it out. The cognitive work that we have to do is being redistributed among different tasks. It's now not as much focus on writing the code per se, but maybe now we have a bit more time to do more quality work in terms of thinking about specifying our requirements and thinking about our requirements, and also maybe a bit more time on the verification side. So it's more a redistribution of our work, and maybe a bit less work on, the writing of the code part.
yeah. So, I mean, when you mention about shop closing because of not, I mean, like the calculator not available, right? So I think sometimes also this happen, right? So when we all have used AI a lot, and when the AI tool is down, kind of like down, right? Cloud
Oh
happens
yeah.
sometimes. It's not available. Like we just
Oh
stop. Like
yeah.
we
Oh
don't
yeah.
even feel of working.
This is also not new. I remember when Stack Overflow. So like I'm probably quite a bit older than you, and I remember Stack Overflow, the shift that it had in software development, and it really came to my notice when I brought my entire group off campus. We went to do a hackathon at a sailing club close to where I live. And we set everything up. We had a network, we had all the source code on our machines. Everything was there. And the internet went down. And my students just said, "Oh, I can't code." And I'm like, "Yes, you can. Yes, you can. We have all of the code locally. We don't need the network. We've nothing in the cloud. Everything's here." And they're like, "No, no, no. Stack Overflow's not working." And I'm like, "You don't need Stack Overflow." "Oh no, I need Stack Overflow. I literally can't work without Stack Overflow." So this is, again, not new. And so we're seeing it now again, right? With chat. I mean, and actually talking about developers being tired. some of them are saying, I love it when my tokens are used up because I actually get a break. So, there's the flip side of that as well, because they're like, oh, there's nothing I could do, right, without it working. So, yeah.
Yeah. So speaking about token usage, right? There's this trend called tokenmaxxing. Some companies also kind of like enforce everyone, not just developers, right? Everyone in the company to use AI as much
Yeah.
as possible, right? And
Yeah.
even put that as part of their performance, like the
Yeah.
KPIs, right? So which is bad. But you mentioned about, for managers out there, right, who are having this kind of trend within their company, right? Is there any kind of like warning sign that they need to kind of like pick up when all these cognitive debt, maybe intent debt, are actually exacerbating, situations that is happening within their team? So what are the warning signals that you think people can pick up? So,
Yeah.
okay, I see this trend going there. Maybe we should stop a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the warning signs are some of the things we've talked about a little bit already. I think fatigue is one of them. If people are really tired and being, are burnt out, that's definitely a warning sign that I think you need to look for. Not talking to each other as much. But things like, somebody makes a change and it breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. They're not sure who knows who to fix it. They get surprises when they make a change. Their end users are, despite them going faster, the end users are not as happy. I think we're hearing some of that. I do think this Tokenmaxxing metric, I mean, there's so many people pushing back against that. I don't think I need to say much about that. Just be on LinkedIn a few minutes and you see people pushing back against it. It's kind of ironic to me that so many companies are, using that as a metric, when we spent so long trying to get them away from, lines of code. It's sort of that, but only worse. What they're not doing, though, is taking enough time, giving enough time, psychological safety, right, to their teams to learn how to use those tools and to talk about their experience, or even to share their experience, like from one team to the other. We see a little bit of this in LinkedIn, right? People are sharing their knowledge, but sometimes within companies, in large companies, they don't share knowledge that much. They don't know what a team over here is doing. And yet one team, I'll sometimes observe that, oh, there's this part of the org that really has it nailed, and this other part of the org does not. And yet they're not talking to each other. And so, and yet there's this thing from on high, oh, we're going to use, tokens as a metric. So I think that's very, very dangerous to do that, especially when a lot of developers feel like they're under surveillance and they're basically, what they're doing is training, they're automating away their jobs, right, by being watched of what they're doing so that a bot can, some bot can take over, or some agent can take over. Yeah. So anyway, Tokenmaxxing. Yeah. Bad. In a word, really bad. Yeah.
Anyway, the token cost is increasing lately as well. So I
Yes.
think this trend won't continue because
No.
it might get very costly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
speaking about understanding about this warning sign, and people now know about this danger of cognitive debt, intent debt, what is the solution, right? So what people can do in order to avoid this? And I know that you're also working on this tool called Cognitive Tour. Maybe give us a glimpse of how do we solve this?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I think that there's a lot of tools and processes and practices coming out to address both of these things. They're fragmented. Different people are trying different things. With intent debt, I see a lot of tools coming. As I said, most of them are more focused on how do we help the agents rather than the humans. But still, this articulation of the goals and all of the important decisions is starting to happen. But it's the cognitive part that, at least today, a few weeks ago, I was worried more about intent debt, but today I'm more worried about cognitive debt because I don't see a lot of tools or practices coming out to address that. I'm starting to see some. Rahul Garga, who works, I think, at ThoughtWorks, is talking about stuff, and there are other. Russell Miles is also working on, improving the habitat for developers that addresses repairing cognitive debt. My student Artie Starr is contributing to that as well. But in general, I'm not seeing a lot. And so Cognitive Tours is actually a tool or an idea for a tool that I got from sailing, from from using a GPS on my boat. This is why taking time off is important, because you get some cool ideas when you take time off. And on our boat, we have a logbook that we record everything in, not just about where we're going and why we're going there, and when we should leave, weather conditions and so on. But we also record a lot of information in that logbook about our boat. So information about when we replaced, that reminds me, I have to replace a piece of equipment and I keep forgetting. Sorry, that's an aside, but that's an example of intent debt. We have intent debt on our boat right now. We don't write down all the things that we should be doing. But your logbook keeps track of these things, of all of the important things that you need to know, so that later on when you need to make a decision or you need to understand what happened, something didn't go well there. What did we not do well? And so you can go through the logbook and see, what it is that you need to know. What is the important information? And then the other thing that I have on the boat is the GPS, and this notion of waypoints. So waypoints are kind of like bookmarks, but they have more metadata. And I have different types of waypoints. So I have waypoints that show me safe places to anchor, and I have waypoints that might show me where to catch the salmon that I seem to keep catching every time I go to this spot, and where is a good spot for prawns, and so on. Where's a good place to buy propane? Those kind of decisions. And so they're these tight bookmarks, if you like. They're called waypoints. You can add annotations to them in your GPS, and then you can share them with other people. And you can create tours. So they're, they have location, and you can create a tour or a route out of these waypoints. And you can use that then to navigate, right, to your destination. And you can also share it with other people. Now, the idea, of course, when you're on a sailboat is that you always have to be constantly changing your plans. And the same with software as well. So years ago, together with some students, we wrote a plugin for, I don't know if you remember the Eclipse tool, and we wrote a plugin that allowed us to create waypoints and routes or tours through the waypoints. And the idea of the tour is that it's a slice, if you like, through your software system, right? So, our software system is all of our code, it's all of our requirements, maybe it's all of our commits, it's all of our messages. And you could create a tour, you could create a path through all of that information that would then serve a purpose. So I'm building this tool right now myself, using the tool. And so last night I added a new feature. I added, I was running a local database at first because I was just trying to use it for me. And last night I created I used Terso so I could, share it with other people. So it's running in the cloud. And I wrote a tour as I was adding this feature of different waypoints to help remind me what it is, what are the important decisions that I'm making, what are the main code components, what did I do, what things should I watch for the next time I go back. And so it's a slice through your information so that you can give that to somebody to answer a question. So it might be for me, probably a month from now, because I don't get to code very much these days, I'll look at it and I'll go, oh yeah, right. That's how I did that thing. And if it breaks, hopefully I have a starting point. So tours can be useful for documenting, how you did something. They may be useful for onboarding or explaining a feature. I have a tour that is all of the things that I want to do and add to this, what are, and so on. So from intent, from the why, all the way through to how I verify something could be a tour, for example. I hope that is a good description.
Yeah, sounds really interesting, right? The way when you mention all this, right? So the way I kind of like have in my mind is kind of like a journal in a sense. Also at the same time, also kind of like the architecture decision record that some people also practice in the past, right? So maybe you since you are building the tool, how do you envision us using the tool day to day, right? Is it something that is built as part of the ID, or is it part of the AI agent itself? Like how do you envision this tool being used day to day?
Yeah, I'm actually playing with a few approaches because I'm using it myself to see like where this should live or sit. My ideas around this are more at the idea mechanism level, and then how we instantiate it in a tool will play out, right, as we use it. I just want to go back to one thing that you said about architecture decision records. So in my tool, I have a waypoint type of architecture decision records. So those are actually waypoints in my tour. I see, in terms of where I see it working, it could be as simple as a skill. maybe even the AI agent could help you generate the tour, not fully automated. I'll get to that in a minute. So it could sit, with the agents, or it could be within the IDE. I think if you're using the IDE, then that's where it belongs. That's where we had it before with Eclipse. It was, we ran a browser within the IDE, and we could show the tour, and people could kind of step through it. And then from each of the waypoints, you could then, for the ones that had a link to corresponding source code, they could click on it and go to the source code. So they could literally step through different parts of the system and different kinds of artifacts to kind of dig in and read more detail about that. I hope that answers the full question that you asked. I feel like I might have forgotten something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way I see it also, yeah, you can have a skills from time to time that can kind of like prompt you to do this. Which leads me to the next thing that I find also very interesting that you mentioned, right? It's called strategic friction, right? We are moving so fast now with AI, right? So why do we need to have this strategic friction, right? Maybe because of slowing down, we have to slow down, right? So what exactly the form of strategic friction that you can advise people to do?
Yeah. So I think the cognitive tours, so I just remembered what I wasn't explaining very well. So I think of the cognitive tours as cognitive infrastructure to help navigate from the intent layer to the technical layer. I mean, if you had three developers working very, very closely together, building a tool from scratch, they may not need to write anything down. They all understand how it works. They all know who knows what on the team. And so maybe articulating that or having, a way of helping you capture it is not needed. But with moving so fast and things happening over time, having that ability to document and construct your understanding, I think is super powerful. So one of the things that I'm trying to do to myself and marginally it's succeeding at, but succeeding a little, is I'm using the tours at the moment. I am going to add AI assistants to help reduce some of the unnecessary friction. But some of the necessary friction, I think, is going slow enough that you understand the things that you need to understand. The decisions that you've made, the insights that you had about your user needs, maybe, even down to some of the implementation of the features that you're building, the different features that you're building, how those connect, what abstractions you're using, what dependencies maybe there are, right, between your features and also across your different components. And so what I'm doing is I'm documenting those manually as I go through, right? I have spec kit, I have one Claude window open, just Claude Chat, helping me with the spec stuff. And then I have Claude Code helping me with the code. And then I have my own tool where I'm documenting, what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, creating those waypoints, creating that tour so I can come back to it later on and create that bridge, if you like, from intent to code and back again, right? So I can look at the code and be able to go back. So that's an example of friction, is slowing down. Another example of friction that I think teams could look at is using more retrospectives or meetings, whatever you want to call them, or code inspection meetings to slow down and not just review the code and have a little checkbox that says, yes, a human looked at this. Did they understand? How do we know? We don't know. So, slowing down to, I built this thing. Let me come to a meeting and explain how I built it. And that has so much value. Because now you're not only sharing your understanding with your team, but as you're explaining it to somebody, actually, I was doing this yesterday. I was explaining some of the architecture of my own tool, and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have done it that way. So by explaining it, we get that deeper insight into our design that we're surrendering, right, to the agents. I mean, there's arguments about whether we will ever need to look at code in the future, but right now I feel like we still have to have somehow control, right, over the code and over the architecture. I think those are some examples of friction, and going slow. Keith Mann said something in a meeting to me the other day. He said, cars have brakes so that they can go faster. And I think, we need to think about how can we design breaks, into our environments, our development environments, or our habitats, as Russ Smiles is calling it, so that we can slow down and actually build the understanding that we need so that we can more safely and more efficiently eventually build the software that not just we feel comfortable with, but that our end users really want as well.
Yeah. I like the way that you mentioned, cognitive tool help to bridge the gap between intent and the kind of like the technical implementation. I think that is super important, right? Because sometimes if we just use AI vibe coding, I don't think we even understand the intent that we wanted to do, because AI will just suggest a lot of things out of the box, whether we want it or not want it. So I think definitely that's super important, right? So speaking about, people, being replaced by agents and all that, I've heard anecdotally in some, meetups that I go to, some people think that we can reduce really the amount of people that we need simply by, adopting a lot more agentic workflow, automation and things like that. Is there a danger, do you think, that if we rely less on humans and rely more on these agents?
Oh, I think there's lots of danger in that, of course. I mean, this question comes up every time with automation. I think the closest period in history to what we have happening right now is the Industrial Revolution. There's a really interesting book about that called Blood in the Machine, where the workers that were being replaced, would burn the factories, down, and the automation, and they would riot because they were losing their craft, right? And they were losing their jobs and their livelihood. And the machines could be run by children, that were then, being abused and not well looked after to do it. And it took some time, right, before that kind of worked out. But there was a shift, right, in roles, and I think we're going to see the same with software as well. That some roles are going to change, right? I think, I'm in a software engineering program, and some students are worried that software engineers are not going to have work. I think the opposite is going to happen, actually. I think as we have, more ability to create more software, we're innovative, right? Humans are innovative, and we always want more, right? And so we're just going to keep wanting more and more software. And we're going to need, I think, sure, we can have some agents keeping track of some things, but I think it's going to open up new opportunities for other human tasks, in terms of, talking to other humans, or making trade-offs, or evaluating solutions within that context. So I think we're going to see a shift. Are jobs overall going to be lost? Perhaps. I don't know. I'm not an economist. I can't, really predict that. But I think overall there are going to be new roles that are going to come out, and that we're going to have to, go back to maybe building better software that is more secure, and that is, more reliable, performs better, and meets our needs. There was also a few years ago, many years ago, decades ago, when computers were being introduced into the offices, and there was, this vision that paper would disappear, the paperless office. And to a certain extent, that happened, but it took a very, very long time. And if you go into any office right now, I can guarantee that you will see a lot of paper in the office. A lot of things are still used by paper. So I think, we can look at that and go, yeah, that's not quite going to happen yet, right? But I think some organizations maybe had too many developers after COVID. So some of that is a correction because of that as well.
Yeah. So I want to bring the loop back to what we discussed 3 years ago, right? So when we discussed back then, we were talking a lot about developer productivity, right? What actually drives, maybe developers' happiness and things like that. So do you think with all this AI thing happening, right, and this debt model that you just came up with, right? So what actually changed in that equation of developer happiness, developer productivity? Is there something that you think there's a new thing that needs to be introduced in that?
Yeah, I think the space framework, we had the five of us, I think it was five of us, got together a few weeks ago, actually, and we had a panel at the University of California at Irvine, and we talked about that there. And I think the 5 dimensions stand up pretty well. to AI. I think the way that you maybe think about each of those dimensions and the things that you look at have shifted. Maybe you remember satisfaction is about, well-being and satisfaction of developers using the tools. Performance is, what are outcomes from the things that we're trying to build, the quality of those outcomes. What is activity or the lines of code, or the number of tokens that we use or the number of PRs that we do. And then communication and collaboration is about that shared understanding and coordination with others. And then finally, efficiency and flow is that, can people make progress confidently and efficiently? And are they also experiencing flow, which then leads back to satisfaction? So I think there's a lot of open questions right now about each of these dimensions. In terms of well-being, you brought up one of them yourself. Are developers exhausted from using these AI tools? What is the impact on cognitive fatigue happening on their learning, on their sense of, to thrive, our competency and how much autonomy we have affect how happy we are in work and our well-being. And our research that we did earlier showed that developers that are satisfied with their work will be more productive, right? Will be more creative in the things that they're building. So we need to be looking at that. What is the impact of AI on developer well-being? And are they being honest when we ask them questions in surveys? Because they may be afraid to answer, I hate AI, right? But more about understanding how can it help them thrive and still feel, that they're building a craft using AI, that they still have that craft, not just being replaced, is important. Maybe I'll just talk about flow. I've got some research going on with some colleagues at the moment. Our papers on archive, we just put a new version together. I'm not sure it's up yet, called Good Vibrations, where we looked at vibe coding and we looked at the implications around, on the theory of flow. And as I mentioned, my student, Artie Starr, for her PhD work is looking at the theory of flow, two sides, the troubleshooting side and building and sustaining momentum. And so looking at those as we use AI are very, very fascinating questions as we go forward. And then the performance, one, I hear a lot about that, that a lot of the metrics are moving, but not necessarily the outcome metrics are moving, which is kind of, are users actually happier or not? So I think, paying attention to that. I talked about that boat. We're definitely going like super fast. But are we going in the right direction? And yeah, sure, we can use AI to also continuously deploy and even do A/B testing. But maybe that A/B testing is not asking the right question. Maybe things have shifted, right? And then communication and collaboration. I looked at over the years the way companies use space and define metrics. And one thing I was always worried about was that you can't just pick these metrics and then change one and then see what happens to the others. You really need a theory about why you might put an intervention in place and a hypothesis about what that might have. What will it improve maybe here, but, bring more challenge over here. And so I think using space in that way is really important as we're trying to do a lot of sense making about how AI is having an impact. And collaboration is one of the things that, I don't think we could study that fast enough. Because it's changing. And it's not just a team is now not just, developers, but it's also agents. And how do they work across, different team members? I have some research going on with a couple of folks from Monash University on that topic right now as well. So, yeah, so I think the five dimensions are pretty solid. We thought long and hard about them. They came from years of research. And they were pretty solid. But what we look at, the kinds of questions that we ask and our theories about how AI is impacting them are what we have to really kind of dig into now. Yeah.
Yeah, super excited to hear your new research, right, about all this flow and all that. So I'm glad that the theory also holds kind of like this space framework, right? And people can still use them. And I think one thing that you also have called out, right? These things have happened in the past, right? But the sheer level of how it happens, I think probably is the difference now, right? The speed actually kind of like enforce us actually to look back at all these researches that we have done, right? This past trend, and maybe we can also learn from those as well. So, Margaret, it's been a pleasure, again, having you talking about this. I always find myself learning a lot, right? Because I'm quite fascinated by this topic. So, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. Before I let you go, I have one last question. If you still remember, I have this question called 3 Technical Leadership Wisdom. So, maybe if you can share something today, that would be great.
Yeah, you did give me a heads up on this, and I didn't have time to think what are the 3 things, but I'll try to suggest 3. I don't know if they're the top 3 for me, but I think one of them is not just rely on metrics for measuring what's happening with AI. The metrics are measuring constructs, which may or may not really measure the thing that you think. And actually, it won't by definition, right? Metrics are a proxy for the things that we're trying to understand. And so I think, they can help. They're definitely useful signals. But I would recommend to leadership to make sure that they are staying very close in touch with developers. When I visited Microsoft for a sabbatical some years ago, I learned the most from going to lunch with developers than I did from doing formal interviews or surveys. It was going to lunch. It's where you really kind of learn, what's working well, what's not, what are the risks. They're usually very, very smart folks. And so sitting down and having conversations with them, observing their work. And I think everybody at every level in the organization should, maybe they're not going to start writing code, but they can sit down beside a developer and ask them to walk through what it is that they're doing, and really and not just using the tool, but they're half a day or something to really gain an understanding of what's going on in the organization and what's working well. So that would be one. I think the other one would be, don't just focus on thinking about the code and using tokens. I mentioned some prior work that I think is still foundational. And in the Triple Debt paper, I talk about Peter Nauer's work, where he talks about, what is a software system? It isn't just the code. It's the people, right, that are also involved in what's in their heads and what they know about, how we map the domain to the code, and how, what decisions we've made, and what we can change in the future, and what our design is. And so, really, thinking about, that prior work, thinking about the social level, right, of the system, right, the people on the team, the different roles. Roles are really shifting right now. The boundaries between what is a program manager and a software developer and a designer, those are all shifting. So really thinking about, how your teams are changing shapes and how the different roles are working, I think is critical. Because, helping that, evolve in a good way is going to be really, really important as we go forward to really amplifying how AI is used. And then the third one, I guess, is, about the triple debt. Don't just focus on the code, right? The quality of the code, but be thinking about not just technical debt, but thinking about also, cognitive debt, which I've talked about a lot. I don't need to say more about that, but also about thinking about the end users, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to develop the best software that we can for our end users. And maybe, that now that we're able to generate some of the code and reduce, spend less time maybe on that, maybe we can spend more time really understanding our users, right? And what they need, and are we really building the right things so that we can delight our end users? So yeah, those would be, I think that was 3. It might have been like 7, but anyway.
Yeah, that's a great reminder to always think about the end users, right? So don't just focus on the code and the features that you're building, right? So thinking back to the end users is very important. So Margaret, if people love this conversation, they want to follow up, asking you more questions, is there a place where they can find you online and your paper?
Yeah, I could share the paper with you if you like, the link to that. It actually was just published yesterday. It appeared in ACMQ.
Congrats.
So it's yeah, I was thrilled that they accepted it. And I have some slides that expand on that a little bit as well. If you want that link, I'm on LinkedIn. My email is broken for me. I get too many. LinkedIn is still sort of okay. Can try that. Yeah, LinkedIn is
Right.
probably a good place to find me. Yeah.
Right. Definitely, we'll put that in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for this time today. I hope people learn a lot about the importance of, putting effort on avoiding cognitive debt and also the intent debt, right?
Yeah.
Outside of the technical debt, which is, I think, in some software teams, we are still having that.
Oh, it's still a challenge. Technical debt has not gone anywhere in terms of it being a challenge. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Goodbye for now.
Yeah. Nice to see you again. Yeah. Take care.